Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who says I have to share my land because I have more. A few months ago, I woke up unusually early one morning, well before the sun considered peeking over the distant hills of my family's farmland. I'm not typically an early riser, but on that morning I had a feeling I needed to check on the western boundary of my property. For context, I own a considerable piece of land, a large farm that has been in my family for a few generations. My grandparents bought it decades ago. Back then, it was just a rundown patch of scraggly fields. Over time, through long summers of sweat and blistered hands, we turned it into a fully functional and quite prosperous farm. We have a mix of fields, a modest orchard, a small pond for irrigation, and a comfortable farmhouse at its center. The property line is clearly marked with old wooden posts and carefully maintained fencing. I know exactly where every inch of my land begins and ends. It's my life out here, and I treasure every foot of it. That particular morning, I felt compelled to head out early because of a strange sound I'd heard late the previous evening. It was a dull mechanical roar, something like a diesel engine running at low throttle. At the time, I assumed someone in the distance was hauling equipment along the main road, but the noise sounded too close, and we don't usually have machinery running at odd hours around here. The next morning, the unease grew so strong that I pulled on my work boots, grabbed a flashlight, though it was almost dawn by then, and headed down the gentle slope toward where my neighbor's property abuts mine. My neighbor, whom I'll call Randall, moved in about a year ago. He purchased a small plot that was once part of a larger estate that had been subdivided. His land borders my western fields. Initially, I tried to be neighborly with him. I waved hello a few times, invited him over for iced tea back when the leaves were turning last fall. He came over once, stayed for about 15 minutes, answered my questions in single words, and left. I didn't pry. Some folks just aren't social. I didn't hold it against him. I figured we'd just peacefully coexist, maybe help each other out in a pinch. Farming communities are generally like that. And even though he didn't farm himself, I assumed he'd appreciate the quiet life out here. As the sky lightened, I approached the western boundary line. The grass there was still covered in a thin layer of dew. I remember how the world smelled that morning. Fresh earth, pine from the stand of trees nearby, and the faint sweetness of my orchard's blossoms drifting over from the southeast. But as I got closer, I smelled something else. It was a smell of churned soil and disturbed ground that didn't belong. And then I heard a slight rumble again, this time more like a distant hum. Climbing over the old boundary fence, something I'm allowed to do on my side, I noticed something startling. On my property, a good 20 yards in from the agreed-upon property line, was a massive hole. It looked like a deep pit about 6 or 7 feet across and at least 4 feet deep by then, though it was hard to tell exactly. Standing beside this hole was a backhoe, rented from a local equipment supplier, one I recognized. And there, giving instructions to a couple of workers I'd never seen before, was my neighbor, Randall. He stood with his arms crossed, nodding his head as if everything were perfectly normal. My mind was racing. How had I not noticed something this drastic sooner? I'd been in my orchard most of the previous day, pruning some older apple trees and cleaning up broken branches after a late-season storm had passed through. The orchard is on the opposite side of the property, and I hadn't made my usual rounds that evening. Still, to brazenly start digging a hole on someone else's property without even mentioning it seemed unbelievable. I cleared my throat loudly as I approached. The workers looked up first. One of them, a younger guy wearing a stained baseball cap, tried to avoid my gaze. Randall turned around slowly, a hint of annoyance on his face. I asked calmly at first, "What's going on here?" Maybe, just maybe, there was some kind of misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew no good explanation would justify digging a giant hole in the center of my land without permission. Randall, without missing a beat, said something like, "We're putting in a septic tank." I blinked. "On my land?" I asked. I tried to remain calm. This was surreal. He nodded matter-of-factly. "I'm building a septic system for my house. My plot is too small for it, and I need to set the tank somewhere. Your farm is large. You're out here alone. You can afford to share a bit of space." I remember standing there, my jaw literally dropping open. I managed to say, "You can't be serious. This is my property. You can't just decide to dig a hole for your septic tank here." Randall shrugged as if I'd asked him why the sky was blue. "I have to put it somewhere. If I try to put it on my own land, I won't have room for my driveway expansion. Besides, you have so much space. Show some humanity, this won't bother you." Now, I've lived around all kinds of people. Some are tough, some are kind, some are eccentric. but this was pure entitlement. I responded, "You're building on my property without my permission. This is illegal. Stop right now and fill that hole in." He pursed his lips and gave a dismissive gesture. "I've started already. It's too late to stop now. Let's be reasonable. Once the tank is in, it's no skin off your back. You barely use this part of your field." At that point, anger coursed through me, but I tried to remain steady. I told him he needed to cease immediately, get that machine off my land, and never try something like this again. Randall's response was a scoff. He said something like, "If you try to stop me, we'll see what happens." It was more of a vague threat than a direct one, but I didn't like it at all. I turned around and headed straight back to my house. The workers called after me, sounding uncertain, but I ignored them. I knew that in situations like this, the first step is to get legal advice and involve the proper authorities. I wasn't going to waste time arguing in my own field. If he wanted to push me, I'd push right back. Back at the farmhouse, I grabbed my phone and called the county office. I've lived here all my life, so I know exactly who to talk to. I explained the situation to a county clerk who sounded stunned. She put me through to a zoning officer. The zoning officer, an older gentleman who'd helped me with a permit for a new tool shed a couple of years back, remembered me. He was equally shocked, promised to come out later that day to take a look. Meanwhile, I called a friend of mine, Lamar, who knows a few local attorneys. Lamar was a big help. He told me that what Randall was doing was a blatant trespass and violation of property rights. He said I should also photograph everything before anyone tries to fill in or cover up what they've done. So I marched back out there, camera in hand. By the time I got back to the hole, Randall and his workers were gone, but the backhoe was still parked in my field. The pit looked deeper now. They must have kept digging after I left. I took dozens of photos from every angle. I also took a video, narrating the situation, making sure to show the property line markers in the background. With evidence in hand, I felt more prepared. That afternoon, the zoning officer arrived. He took one look and declared that what Randall was doing violated local building codes, environmental guidelines, and basic private property rights. He said he would issue a stop work order immediately. He also suggested I consult a lawyer to get a proper injunction. I thanked him, and we left it at that for the moment. The next day, I got a call from a local lawyer, someone Lamar recommended. Over the phone, I explained the entire scenario. He told me it was one of the most outrageous trespassing cases he'd heard in a while. He suggested filing for a temporary restraining order to stop any work and then pursuing damages. I liked that plan. That same afternoon, I headed over to Randall's place to talk to him calmly one last time. I'm a believer in giving people a chance to correct their behavior before unleashing legal measures. I knocked on his door, and after what felt like an eternity, he finally answered. He looked irritated, holding a coffee mug and raising an eyebrow as if I were a door-to-door salesman. I said, "Randall, the county's been out. I've spoken to a lawyer. You must remove your equipment from my property and fill in the hole. You cannot build your septic tank there." He smirked in a way that made my skin crawl. "I have a small plot of land. You have a big one. It's unfair that you have so much and I have so little. I'm just evening things out. Besides, you can't use that piece of land for much. It's practically wasted space." I tried reason. I told him, "That doesn't matter. It's my land. I have every right to decide what happens on it. You wouldn't want me digging a giant trench through your driveway, would you?" He shrugged. "I'm not you," he said condescendingly. "You wouldn't do that because you're trying to be a good neighbor." He seemed to believe he had some moral high ground. He actually tried to guilt me by saying something like, "Be a kind person, show compassion. If you were a really good person, you'd let me finish." At that point, I lost any sympathy I might have had. "No," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "You started all this without my permission. You did it secretly, and you insult me by telling me I have to accept it. I will not let you continue. You are now my opponent in this. You brought it on yourself." He slammed his door in my face. So much for talking it out. Now that the battle lines were drawn, I wasted no time. With the help of my attorney, I filed the necessary paperwork to get a restraining order. Within a week, I had a court order demanding that Randall cease any work. I posted a copy at the edge of my property and handed one to him personally. The next time I looked out over that field, the backhoe was gone. The giant hole remained, a big muddy scar in my once pristine land. Meanwhile, I started to worry about other things. If Randall was willing to do something so reckless and entitled, would he try something else? I decided to install a few trail cameras facing that part of the property. These cameras were well hidden in trees and fence posts. They'd catch any trespassing attempts day or night. I also made sure to keep my gates locked. You never know how someone might escalate. Over the next couple of weeks, I consulted with a civil engineer to assess the damage. He said that installing a septic tank there could have contaminated my well water. The water table in that area was sensitive. If Randall had succeeded, my family's main water source could have become compromised. This wasn't just a land grab, it was a health hazard. I thanked my lucky stars I caught him early. I also started talking to neighbors. Though we don't live in a crowded area, there are a few houses within a mile radius, including some folks who had known my family for years. Word spread quickly about Randall's stunt. Most neighbors were appalled. One older gentleman, Marlon, who had lived here longer than anyone, said he'd never heard of something like this happening before. Marlon mentioned that Randall had once asked him if he could run a drainage ditch through part of Marlon's field. Marlon had refused, and Randall had never bothered him again. It seems Randall was shopping around, looking for someone to take advantage of. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I hired a surveyor to confirm the boundary lines, just in case Randall tried to argue that he misunderstood where the property line was. The surveyor's results were crystal clear. Randall's tank hole was not just a few inches over the line, it was a full 20 yards into my field. There was no excuse. With these confirmed facts, I decided to sue Randall for trespassing and damages. The lawsuit included the cost of filling the hole, regrading the land, and compensation for the time and money I spent dealing with his mess. My attorney believed we had a strong case. We requested a trial date, which would likely be months away, but I was patient. The important thing was to let the legal process unfold. In the meantime, I tried to go on with my life. Spring turned into early summer, and I focused on my orchard, my vegetable fields, and my small herd of dairy goats. I had fencing to repair after the last storm, and I was planning to expand my greenhouse. But I kept an eye on Randall. For weeks he laid low. No workers came to my field, and he stayed inside his house most of the time. Or at least I didn't see him much. Then one morning, as I was checking my orchard, I noticed something strange. A young apple sapling I'd planted a few months ago looked damaged. It was snapped at the base. I thought maybe it was a deer or some animal rubbing against it. But when I looked closely, I noticed footprints in the soft dirt. Human footprints. And not too far away, I found a discarded piece of cloth, like a torn bit of a work glove. I checked my trail cameras. Sure enough, late the night before, a figure had crept onto my property from Randall's direction. The camera caught him sneaking through the field, heading towards my orchard. The footage was grainy in the darkness, but it seemed to match Randall's build and height. He did something to the sapling, pulled or kicked it, then hurried back toward his property. This was vandalism. I made sure to save the footage and reported it to the county sheriff's department. They came out, took a look, and said they'd have a talk with Randall. It might not rise to the level of an arrest, but it showed a pattern of harassment. Randall's behavior was pushing me further. This wasn't just about the septic tank anymore. It was about protecting what was mine from a spiteful neighbor who had no respect for boundaries or property rights. I considered installing a few more cameras, maybe even a motion-activated light. Meanwhile, I got a call from my attorney. He suggested we gather all evidence, photos, videos, surveyor reports, vandalism reports, and present it to the judge as part of our ongoing case. I was all for it. Weeks passed and things stayed quiet. I focused on the lawsuit and making sure my land was well protected. One day, I got a visit from the health department. Apparently, Randall had applied for permits related to a septic system, likely after his initial clandestine attempt. The health inspector wanted to confirm boundaries and soil conditions. I showed him where the hole had been dug and explained the entire situation. The inspector shook his head, clearly upset that someone would try something so reckless. He noted that Randall's own plot of land was indeed small and would pose challenges for a septic system, but that was Randall's problem to solve legally and ethically. The inspector also noted that if Randall tried to argue he had my permission, which I never gave, the inspector would need official documentation. Of course, there was none. As the legal process dragged on, I learned more about Randall's background. I pieced together bits of gossip from neighbors and public records. Randall had moved here from a city a few states over. He apparently had some disputes with previous neighbors over property lines as well, though nothing this outrageous. It seemed he was someone who always felt shortchanged and looked for ways to take what he wanted from others. Perhaps he thought a quiet farming community would be easy to bully. He was wrong. About 3 months after the incident, we had our first court hearing. It wasn't the final trial, just a preliminary hearing to discuss the restraining order and the evidence. My attorney presented photos of the hole, the surveyor's report, and the camera footage of nighttime trespassing. Randall's attorney tried to downplay the severity. He argued that Randall misunderstood the property lines, but the surveyor's report and the very noticeable distance from the boundary markers made that argument laughable. My attorney pointed out that if Randall truly misunderstood, he would have stopped the moment I confronted him, apologized, and corrected his mistake. Instead, he insulted me, tried to continue, and then vandalized my property afterward. The judge seemed unimpressed by Randall's excuses. He upheld the restraining order and advised Randall's side that they were on very shaky ground. After the hearing, Randall avoided my gaze as we left the courtroom. Over the next month, I could feel that Randall was getting desperate. He had no driveway expansion. He had no septic tank on my land. He was stuck dealing with his own cramped property. One afternoon, I noticed a group of surveyors on his land. They were measuring out something, probably exploring if he could legally fit the septic system there, or if he'd have to abandon certain modifications to his driveway. It must have pained him to realize he'd have to follow the rules like everyone else. Then, out of the blue, I received a letter from Randall's attorney suggesting a settlement. They proposed that Randall would pay me a modest sum if I would allow the septic tank to remain where it was. They even dangled a monthly payment, like rent. The gall of this proposition was astounding. He wanted to legitimize his initial trespass by bribing me into allowing it. I refused without a second thought. My attorney wrote back firmly that we would not negotiate with someone who so blatantly violated our rights. With settlement off the table, we pushed for a trial date to seek full damages. Meanwhile, I wanted that hole filled. Until the legal matter was settled, I didn't want to disturb the scene because it was evidence. But the giant pit in my field was an ugly reminder of what had happened. Eventually, with court permission and proper documentation, I filled it in, making sure to log every expense. That would go into the damages claim as well. As the summer turned to fall, the trial finally came. It wasn't a big media spectacle or anything like that, just a local court matter. But I brought all the evidence: photos, videos, witness statements, the zoning officer, the surveyor, the health inspector, and the vandalism report. Randall's attorney tried to argue that Randall had some kind of implied consent, that I had a big farm and never explicitly told him he couldn't put a septic tank there. The judge saw right through that. He actually asked, "Are you implying that a property owner must explicitly forbid every possible construction project a neighbor might imagine on their land?" Randall's attorney sputtered, but had nothing coherent to say. My attorney highlighted the malicious behavior: the nighttime trespass, the damage to my young apple sapling, and Randall's failure to comply after being told to stop. The judge asked Randall directly if he thought he had the right to use someone else's property just because he considered it large and underutilized. Randall, cornered, mumbled something about fairness and space. The judge's face hardened. This wasn't going well for Randall. When the dust settled, the judge ruled in my favor. Randall was found liable for trespassing, damages, and harassment. The judge ordered him to pay for the cost of filling the hole, the surveyor's fee, my attorney's fees, and a good chunk of additional damages for the vandalism and emotional distress caused by his aggression. The total amount was substantial enough to hurt Randall's pocket. More importantly, the judge warned him that if he ever trespassed again, he'd face even more serious consequences. After the trial, I finally felt some peace. The giant hole had been filled, and the land was level again. I planned to plant a new sapling to replace the one Randall destroyed. Maybe I'd even put a small flower garden there, as a reminder that I'd stood up for myself and my property rights. Randall stayed in his house, barely showing his face. Over the next few weeks, I saw some construction equipment arrive at his place. He must have found a way to put a septic system on his own land, maybe a more expensive and compact one that fits in a smaller area. He never came to apologize. I didn't expect him to, but I made sure everyone in the area knew what he'd tried. In communities like ours, word spreads. He'd have a tough time finding anyone willing to deal with him on friendly terms. He'd earned a reputation as someone who doesn't respect boundaries. I also decided to step up my relationship with local enforcement and community groups. I donated some fresh produce from my farm to a local food drive and invited a few neighbors over for a casual autumn barbecue. Everyone who came knew the story. They supported me. Some even brought small gifts or tools to help me restore the damaged area. That sense of community reminded me that I wasn't alone. I might have a big farm, but I'm not isolated. We look out for each other here. As time passed, I reflected on the incident. It taught me a few valuable lessons. First, no matter how nice and open you are, some people will try to take advantage. You have to stand up for what's yours. Second, the legal system can work if you're patient and gather evidence diligently. I was glad I didn't lose my temper early on or do something rash. Instead, I kept a cool head and relied on proper channels. Third, I learned that even in a quiet farming community, conflicts can arise from unexpected places. You can never be too careful about property boundaries and permissions. A few months later, as I walked along my fields, I looked at the place where the hole had once been. Now it was just a patch of soil that looked a bit newer than the surrounding ground. I'd planted a new apple sapling a few feet away. The young tree was healthy and strong, its tiny leaves shaking in the breeze. I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I'd not only reclaimed my property, but improved it. I had turned a violation into motivation to protect and care for my land even more. Randall keeps to himself now. I've caught a glimpse of him once or twice when I drive by, but we never speak. He might be resentful, but that's his problem. I won't allow anyone to push me around on my own property. I also made sure to keep all the documentation of this event filed away, just in case he tries anything again. Hopefully, he learned his lesson. Life moved on. My orchard produced a decent harvest that year. The goats were healthy, and I sold some extra produce at a local market in the summer. I improved my fencing and installed a better security light near the western boundary. I even put up a more visible boundary marker, not because I needed it, I know my land, but to remind anyone else who might get funny ideas that I take this seriously. In the end, Randall's attempt to commandeer a portion of my property backfired spectacularly. He ended up paying me, dealing with legal troubles, and damaging his own reputation in the community. Meanwhile, I came out stronger, more connected to my neighbors, and more confident in my rights as a landowner. At the end of the day, the moral of this story, if you can call it that, is simple. Don't let anyone trample on your rights. Stand firm, gather evidence, use the legal tools available, and don't back down when you know you're in the right. You never ask to be someone's opponent, but if they force you into that role, you'll show them they chose the wrong person to mess with. Friends, thank you. See you soon.